Charles Dixon strolled down the streets of Cincinnati, Ohio, the city he called home for over 6 decades. The evening air was crisp, and the quiet hum of the city had softened. Storefront lights spilled a warm glow onto the sidewalks, creating an almost ethereal scene. These walks were a ritual for Charles, a retired officer who had once patrolled these very streets. They offered him a chance to reflect, to connect with the place where he had spent years upholding justice and fostering community. His tall frame moved with a quiet confidence, a man at peace with himself and the world, even after all he had seen. But tonight, as he turned onto Elm Street, a subtle shift in the air unsettled the calm. A police cruiser was parked along the curb, its presence stark against the dimly lit street. Leaning against it was Officer Danny Kirkland, his posture tense, his eyes sharp as they scanned his surroundings like a hawk zeroing in on prey. Charles didn't know Kirkland personally, but had heard enough. The young officer's heavy-handed approach had made him a polarizing figure in the community. Kirkland didn't see neighbors or citizens. He saw potential threats, problems waiting to happen. Charles's steady steps carried him closer. For a moment, he thought he might pass without incident. Just 2 men, strangers to each other, crossing paths. But Kirkland's gaze locked onto him, unyielding, scrutinizing. That look wasn't one of casual curiosity. It carried the weight of suspicion, the kind that lingered and pressed. Charles held his composure, walking with the same deliberate calm he had learned in years of navigating tense situations. As he neared, Kirkland's voice cut through the stillness. "Hey you. Hold up a second." Charles stopped, turning slowly to face the officer. His expression was calm, his hands relaxed at his sides. His eyes met Kirkland's, steady but wary, bracing for whatever was coming. "Evening, officer," he said, his deep voice unflinching. "Is there a problem?" Kirkland didn't answer immediately. His narrowed eyes swept over Charles, taking in his stance, his demeanor, even the subtle confidence in his presence. Finally he spoke, his tone clipped and confrontational. "You live around here?" Charles raised a brow, keeping his voice even. "I've lived in this city for over 60 years. Is there a reason you're asking?" "That's not what I asked," Kirkland snapped, stepping closer. "You look out of place. Got any ID on you?" A flicker of frustration stirred within Charles, but he quelled it quickly. This wasn't new. As a retired officer, he had seen this scenario play out countless times. "I'm just out for a walk," Charles replied. "Didn't think I needed ID for that." Kirkland's lips curled into a sneer. "People think they can go wherever they want, do whatever they want, and no one's gonna ask questions. Not tonight." The words hung in the air, heavy and pointed. Charles studied Kirkland, noting the rigid posture and the sharp edge in his voice. It wasn't just authority speaking, it was insecurity, a need to assert control. "Officer," Charles said evenly, his voice carrying a subtle firmness, "I don't want any trouble, but I'm not doing anything wrong. I don't believe I owe you an explanation for walking down the street." Kirkland stepped closer, the streetlight casting harsh shadows across his face. "Don't get smart with me," he growled, his tone low and threatening. "I don't like your attitude." Charles stood his ground, his calm unwavering. He noticed a few passers-by on the other side of the street slowing down, their curiosity drawn to the unfolding tension. He didn't want to create a spectacle, but Kirkland seemed determined to escalate. "Officer Kirkland," Charles said firmly, meeting the younger man's hard gaze, "I suggest we both take a breath. I'm not looking for a fight." Kirkland let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and cutting. "You're not looking for a fight," he mocked. "That's funny because just standing there, you're giving me one." The remark wasn't an insult. It was a revelation. Kirkland wasn't enforcing the law, he was feeding his ego. In his eyes, Charles's refusal to cower was a challenge and affront. The street seemed to grow quieter, the tension drawing even more attention from onlookers who had stopped to watch. Kirkland moved closer, invading Charles's space. "You got something to say?" he sneered, his voice louder now, demanding attention. "Or are you just gonna stand there like you own the place?" Charles's jaw tightened, but his voice remained composed. "Officer, I'm not here to cause a scene. I'm going to continue my walk. If there's nothing else, I'll be on my way." He turned slightly, intending to de-escalate and move on. But Kirkland wasn't finished. "Don't walk away from me," he barked, his voice echoing sharply. Before Charles could fully process the words, he felt Kirkland's hand clamp down on his shoulder, spinning him around with unexpected force. Charles felt the iron grip tighten, a brazen challenge emanating from the younger officer. He inhaled deeply, the steady resolve honed by years of duty surging within him. Planting his feet firmly, he straightened, his commanding presence unwavering as he locked eyes with his aggressor. "Let go of me," Charles said, his voice calm but weighted with the authority of decades in law enforcement. But Kirkland didn't budge. Instead, his lips curled into a sneer, his tone laced with mockery. "You think you're tough? Better than me?" His taunt hung in the air, daring Charles to react. And then the moment shattered, a sharp crack echoing down the street as Kirkland's hand shot up, striking Charles across the face. The force jolted Charles back half a step, though it was surprise, not pain, that made him falter. Gasps rippled through the gathering crowd, the tension thick as a coiled spring. Charles instinctively touched his stinging cheek, but it wasn't the physical blow that burned. It was the sheer audacity of it. Time seemed to freeze, the air heavy with disbelief. Kirkland's smirk deepened, clearly expecting an explosive reaction. He wanted Charles to retaliate, to lose control, to give him the upper hand. But Charles wouldn't take the bait. He straightened slowly, dropping his hand and meeting Kirkland's gaze with steely calm. "That's assault," he said, his voice steady, each word deliberate. "And you know it." The crowd murmured louder now, whispers spreading like wildfire. Phones appeared, their cameras capturing the charged scene. Kirkland's sneer faltered as his eyes darted to the growing crowd, but his pride forced him to double down. "You don't tell me what I know," he spat, though his voice betrayed a flicker of doubt. Charles stepped forward, not aggressively, but with quiet deliberation, reclaiming the space Kirkland had tried to dominate. His tone dropped, firm and unyielding. "I've worn that badge, walked these streets longer than you've been alive, and I know exactly what just happened here." For a moment, Kirkland's bravado wavered, but he leaned closer, lowering his voice into a venomous hiss. "You don't scare me, old man." Charles didn't flinch. His reply was even, almost chilling in its composure. "I'm not trying to scare you, but you should think about who's watching, who's recording. This won't go the way you think." The crowd murmured louder, emboldened by Charles's calm defiance and Kirkland's unraveling confidence. People called out, their voices turning the tide. Kirkland's face flushed, his gaze darting nervously over the gathering onlookers. Yet he pushed forward, barking, "You're under arrest," as he reached for his handcuffs. "For what?" Charles asked, his voice rising just enough to command the crowd's attention. "Walking down the street. Standing my ground after you put your hands on me." Kirkland froze, his hand hovering over his belt, realizing he had no answer. The crowd erupted, their disbelief turning to outrage. "Leave him alone," someone shouted. "That's assault, we all saw it." Others joined in, their voices a wave of defiance. Kirkland's confidence crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. His face burned with anger and humiliation as he stepped back, his posture still tense but retreating. Charles remained unmoving, his steady presence a silent indictment. The murmurs lingered as Kirkland stormed off, his frustration palpable. But the peace didn't last. Barely 10 minutes passed before Kirkland reappeared, flanked by two younger officers, both with hard, unreadable expressions. The trio moved as a unit, Kirkland leading with renewed arrogance, his chest puffed with manufactured authority. Charles didn't flinch. He stood his ground, tall and resolute, as the officers approached. Kirkland's voice rang out, forced and theatrical. "Mr. Dixon, we received a report of a disturbance. Seems you've been causing trouble." Charles's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "A disturbance," he echoed. "The only disturbance I've seen is the one you created." Kirkland smirked, glancing at his colleagues for backup. "That's not what I heard. Witnesses say you assaulted an officer." The accusation dropped like a bomb, the crowd erupting in shock. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the onlookers, disbelief painted on their faces. One of the new officers shifted uneasily, a glimmer of doubt flickering across his expression. But the other stood rigid, his gaze locked on Charles like a predator sizing up its prey. Charles stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his voice cutting through the tension like steel. "You know that's a lie," he said, fixing his gaze on Kirkland. You assaulted me. There are witnesses. Plenty of them. A chorus of voices rose in agreement. We saw it, someone yelled. You slapped him for no reason. Kirkland's smirk wavered, but his pride kept him from retreating. Step back, he barked, his hand inching toward his belt. I won't tell you again. Charles didn't move. He raised a hand, a gesture of calm control, but his words carried unshakable conviction. I'm not stepping anywhere, officer. The air was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm, as Charles fixed Kirkland with an unwavering stare. You brought backup because you thought you could intimidate me, he said, his voice steady but cutting. But I'm not afraid of you. The two officers flanking Kirkland exchanged uneasy glances, their postures stiff but betraying their uncertainty. Around them, the crowd was swelling again, drawn by the unfolding spectacle. Phones were raised, cameras rolling, capturing every charged moment. Then, cutting through the murmurs, a bold voice emerged. An older woman, her presence commanding despite her age, stepped forward. We saw what happened, she declared, her voice sharp and unwavering. That man did nothing wrong. You're the one who attacked him. Kirkland's head snapped toward her, his face darkening with fury. Ma'am, I suggest you keep your distance, he barked, his tone laced with the edge of authority. But the woman didn't flinch. That doesn't make it right, she shot back, her defiance sparking murmurs of agreement from the growing crowd. Charles felt a flicker of hope. The tide was shifting. The crowd wasn't just watching. They were standing with him. He straightened slightly, drawing strength from their support. The younger of Kirkland's backup officers shuffled his feet, his eyes darting nervously between Kirkland and the crowd. Enough of this, Kirkland snapped, his voice rising with frustration. He turned back to Charles, pointing an accusing finger. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest. For what? Charles asked, his voice calm, but carrying just enough volume to ripple through the onlookers. For standing here? For defending myself when you put your hands on me. Kirkland hesitated, his words faltering under the weight of Charles's composure. He searched for a justification, but it hung just out of reach, slipping further with each passing second. Charles seized the opening. You're out of line, Kirkland, and you know it, he said, his tone firm but level. You're angry because I didn't cower. Because I didn't give you the reaction you wanted. But this isn't about me anymore. It's about what's right. And you're on the wrong side of it. The crowd stirred, a soft cheer rippling through their ranks. Kirkland's face burned with anger, his frustration written plainly in the tightness of his jaw, and the storm brewing in his eyes. His backup officers looked visibly torn, one shifting nervously, the other standing rigid but clearly uncertain. The younger officer finally broke the silence, his voice hesitant. Maybe we should take a step back, Danny, he suggested, glancing uneasily at the crowd. There are a lot of witnesses here. Kirkland glared at him, sharp enough to cut steel. But the officer's words lingered like an unwelcome truth. Even the older backup officer's rigid stance softened slightly, doubt creeping into his stern expression. Charles didn't let the moment slip. He straightened his shoulders, his voice rising with calm authority. Officer Kirkland, he said, his tone deliberate, every word carrying weight. You've already made a mistake tonight, and now you're digging yourself deeper. You can keep trying to intimidate me, but it won't work. Not here, not in front of all these people who see exactly what's happening. The crowd murmured their agreement, emboldened by Charles's calm defiance. The older woman stepped forward again, her voice cutting through the thickening tension. We're not going anywhere, she declared. You think you can bully him and just walk away? Not this time. Kirkland's hand twitched near his belt, a reflex born of frustration rather than necessity. But he didn't move. The crowd's unyielding presence, their phones still recording, pinned him in place. His colleagues exchanged awkward glances, their uncertainty now undeniable. Charles took a deliberate step forward, his voice steady but resolute. You have two choices, officer, he said, his gaze locking onto Kirkland's. You can keep pushing this, and I promise you it won't end well. Or you can walk away and let this be a lesson, for all of us. For a moment, Kirkland's pride seemed to wrestle against the mounting pressure, his body taut with anger. But the murmurs of the crowd, the unrelenting calm in Charles's eyes, and the visible unease of his fellow officers finally broke through. With a sharp exhale, Kirkland stepped back, his face flushed with humiliation. "Let's go," he barked, his voice clipped. He spun on his heel and stormed toward his cruiser, his backup following without protest. The retreat was marked by a chorus of murmurs and a few scattered jeers from the crowd. As the taillights disappeared into the distance, the tension in the air began to dissipate. Charles turned to the crowd, his face calm but resolute. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "Thank you for standing up and for speaking out." The older woman stepped forward once more, her eyes filled with admiration. "No, thank you," she said. "You showed us what courage looks like." Charles nodded, his expression softening. "Courage isn't just about standing up for yourself," he said. "It's about standing up for what's right, no matter how hard it gets." The crowd began to disperse, their conversations brimming with newfound energy, a shared sense of purpose. Charles watched them go, his heart heavy but hopeful. Tonight had been a stark reminder of the challenges that still loomed, but it was also proof of the power in standing firm, in refusing to yield to injustice. As the street quieted once more, Charles resumed his walk, his steps steady and purposeful. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, change never was. But tonight, he had planted a seed. And seeds, with time and determination, could grow into something powerful.